Hello and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin from the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Janiszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how you doing this week?
Doing great. How about you, Eric?
Doing fantastic. Although I think we've had a short fall and we're heading into winter already here in New England.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. The leaves are down. It's going to be cool over the weekend, but northern New England's supposed to get snow. I think we're dodging that bullet this week.
Well, yesterday, we had in a 1 mile radius sun, snow, hail, and rain.
Or that grapple stuff.
Yeah.
Like the snow hail, right?
Yes.
We had that Saturday.
So that's weather in New England. If you don't like it, wait 15 minutes, it'll change.
Hey, Thanksgiving is next week, so it's here.
Yep. All right, so over the past few episodes, we've been talking about planning. We talked about a personal growth plan, a business plan, and one of the things we talked about when we were mentioning a business plan is your corporate structure. And that's really one of the places you have to start. So we're going to talk about that today. And we've brought in to help us Rita Tabraham, who is an attorney who works with contracts and business structure. Rita, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So to start off, what, in your opinion, would be one of the first things someone has to consider when they're looking at different business structures?
I would look at the size of the participants and how many people wanted to make decisions and how many people there were involved in both the investment end of things and the management end of things. I would also look at whether they wanted the management to be separate from the investment. So that would be my initial consideration. I would also consider what type of business they would like to go into, whether it's a high risk or a low risk business. So
okay, can you give us some examples of what you would consider high and low risk businesses?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the things I've seen is artists, single sole proprietor artists who make things and sell them at local fairs. You don't see a whole lot of products liability in art.
Right.
But something like a high risk would be any kind of high dollar services or something that involves things that are really important to people, like kids, pets, legal liability, medical liability. Those are all, high risk areas. People get really mad when,
yes.
you mess, when something goes wrong with their children or something goes wrong with their health or their legal situation or finances. So, those are high risk. So.
Yeah, those are the ones that you'd be more likely to have to incorporate in the first place because, the corporation obviously is an entity unto itself. And rather than getting sued personally by somebody, it's better to have that blanket around you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's kind of when I go into something, I look at, like I had somebody, the other thing that I look at too is if it's if the road has already been paved. So for instance, if it's something that is completely new, a new idea, or if it's something that's legally questionable, I might also advise them to have some kind of corporate protection around them. Because you never know what's going to happen with the unknown, I guess is what it comes down to. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Sure. So if you're inventing something, if you're creating something new with technology, you'd want to protect yourself with a corporation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is when states started legalizing the marijuana, and people were coming in and saying, well, gee, it's legal now. And my immediate, reaction was, well, yes, but no. So, that was a situation where I advised corporate protection. If I have a completely new robotics idea or a completely new AI idea or something like that, those are things that I would advise people to get corporate protection around them. So anything that is untested, we don't know how the courts are going to deal with it, the police are going to deal with it. We don't know what the product's liability implications are. Those are all the things that I would advise somebody to, um, have some kind of wall of protection.
All right. So let's go through the different types of corporate structure, and we'll talk about what the advantages and disadvantages are of each. And let's start with the most basic, which is the sole proprietorship.
Sure, absolutely.
So
So
when would somebody want to be a sole proprietor? Use that corporate structure.
Sure. Again, if you have a startup with low liability with a very limited budget, somebody who doesn't know whether they're going to make it in this particular line of business or not. So obviously, you want all of your work or most of your working capital to go towards whatever business it is you're starting up. You don't want to spend all this money on this huge corporate structure only to find out 2 months from now that you're not going to make it in this business.
Sure.
So if it's a low liability business and it's something where you're just starting off an idea and it's relatively low risk, then I would say, yeah, you just want a sole proprietorship right now. Particularly if you want the fluidity and the flexibility to kind of shape your business as you go along. You might want to be able to, the flexibility to take your personal funds and put them into the business. If you have a profit this put them back into the personal funds. That kind of fluidity and flexibility is something that I would say, okay, you're fine with a sole proprietorship right now.
Right. So under a sole proprietorship, there's very little division between the person running the business and the business itself.
Yes, absolutely. So basically, we have I guess you could say, a series of increasing distance um, from the individual, and the where there's the least line of definition is the sole proprietorship. That's you. I mean, you can do a DBA, but at the end of the day, all of your personal assets are still on the line. Your house, your car, it's you. If somebody sues you, it's you. That's pretty much what a sole proprietor is. It's just somebody doing business. And it's usually only one person or a husband and wife. So basically you have incorporated and unincorporated entities. And on the lower end of the division, where there's very little division, is the sole proprietors and the general partnerships. On the high end, where the business entity is completely separated, is corporations and LLCs. And in between, you have your limited partnerships and things of that nature.
All right. So other than the number of people, is there a big difference between a partnership and a sole proprietorship?
One of the practical differences that I see is in a sole proprietorship, again, you are the decision maker. So you're always going to agree with yourself. When you get into partnerships, it's a little bit nicer because you can spread the risk. You're not the only one exposed, but on the other hand, it also means that you have to agree with somebody. You have to have the same business theories and ideas. So what I always tell people going into a partnership is two major things. Number one, don't have an even number, because then you never have a tiebreaker. It is a two-person partnership is the most common form of partnership, but it makes the practicalities a little difficult sometimes, particularly when you start to not agree with your partner. But other than that, a general partnership is pretty much the same. It's unincorporated. There's no filing requirements. You do have a partnership return, so the taxes are a little different, but they're all pass-throughs. So they all end up on your personal taxes, or at least half, or however you build the partnership agreement ends up on your tax returns. Does that make sense?
Does.
Okay.
Yeah, and in a similar vein, when you get to the limited liability company, you also are passing that through on your personal income tax return, but you're filling out a separate schedule with all the business income and expenses on there to come up with a bottom line there. I mean, I think limited liability companies, we've only been able to do like one person LLCs for what, the last several years or so. Didn't you used to have to have a minimum of 2 people to do that?
It varied from state to state, but that was actually one of the nice benefits of the LLCs. Is that if you were a sole proprietor and you did want some form of separation from your business, you could always form a one-person S corp. But now with the one-person LLCs, that's another really nice flexible option.
Yeah, that's the road that I took myself, and I'm sure a whole lot of other entrepreneurs, solopreneurs out there are doing too.
Yeah. For the benefit of our listeners, let's get into what an LLC is. I mean, it stands for Limited Liability Corporation, but what makes that different from your standard corporation?
So basically, what happened was a number of years ago, people were, coming up with all kinds of business structures. And as usual, the IRS said, well, we have our own test as to, whatever you call your business structure, we're going to tell you how we're going to tax your business structure. So they looked at 4 factors. They looked at whether there was a continuous life, whether there was centralized management, whether there was a limitation of liability, and whether there was a free transferability of interest. So basically, prior to that, if you had 3 or more of these, you were considered a corporation. If you had 2 or less, it was considered a partnership or an unincorporated entity. And because of that, people were each of an S corp and a C corp, and each of the partnerships have limitations. And so what a limited liability company is, they actually started in New Hampshire. They're a statutory creature, and they basically say, well, you can pick, and you can it's build your own company is really what it is. So you can decide whether you want the members to manage it, or if you want a sole manager, or a board of managers like you would have in a corporation, or whether you want it managed by all of the members as you would have in a partnership. Then they said that you can decide whether the interests. Let me back up a minute, because in corporations you usually have the management and you have the investors, and usually the investors are the ones that have the limited liability if you look at the overall picture. So again, the IRS, or the statutory scheme for a limited liability company, says you can decide whether you want investors to also be the management, and to also have liability exposure. Actually, let me back up again, because in a partnership, if you have management, you usually have exposure. You have liability exposure. The nice thing about a limited liability company is it is considered a separate entity. So even as an investor, or as a manager, you still have the kind of corporate protection that you would have with a corporation. So it's kind of a mix and match between the corporations and the partnerships.
So it sounds like an LLC has all of the protections of the corporation, but it doesn't have as rigid a structure. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's kind of like when you have a corporation, there are certain rules that need to be followed. With the limited liability company, it gives a lot of the nice protections of a corporation, but still gives the flexibility of a partnership.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds with LLC, they've pretty much found a middle ground between the flexibility of the unincorporated structures and the protection of the incorporated.
Correct. Exactly. So because the other thing is you have the S corps and the C corps, and with the S corps, they have a lot of limitations on who can be the shareholders. For instance, it's limited to 100 shareholders. With an LLC, you can have an unlimited number of investors or shareholders. With an LLC, the citizenship can be both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals. With an S corp, it can only be U.S. citizens. So those are a couple of things. But then on the corporations, on a C corp side, you have the double taxation. So it's not a pass-through entity. So it even kind of combines the best of both worlds of the S corps and the C corps as well. It's a really nice structure, or a really nice entity that you can do a lot with, depending on how you structure it. So.
All right. So, okay, we've mentioned C corps and S corps. Now, as I understand it, the big difference between S corps and C corps is the pass-through of taxes. Is that correct?
It is, but it's not. That's one of the major differences. Absolutely. But there are a number of other things to consider. So with the C corps, there's a lot more flexibility of capitalization. And what I mean by that is with the S corps, like I said, the number of shareholders can only be 100. There's only certain types of investors that are allowed in S corps. So it can only be an individual or an estate or an exempt organization. You can't have an entity, a different entity, be a shareholder of an S corp, unless it's a trust or certain exceptions. You can always, and you frequently hear about other entities being major shareholders of other C corps.
Right. So while a corporation can hold stock in another corporation, another C corp, a corporation can't own shares in an S corp.
Correct. Exactly. But another entity can be an investor in an LLC too, which is another nice feature of the LLC. Typically, S corps are not publicly traded. So let's say you have an idea that takes off, and you want to really get some capitalization going, and you want to make an initial public offering, initial stock offering. You could really only do that pretty much with a C corp. Again, there's limitations on public offerings with the S corps.
Well, if you're looking at large scale monetization, venture capital, IPOs, aren't you pretty much limited to a C corp if you're going after that level of money?
You can have an LLC. on that big
Oh,
level.
okay.
But most typically you see the C corps. But and again, that's why I'm saying this. The LLC is such a flexible creature. You know, there's just so much you can do with it. Another really nice thing about the C corps is they have a lot of flexibility in the classes of stock. So what, you might have preferred stock and common stock. You might have voting shares and non-voting shares. Those are all, that's another feature of the LLCs as well, where you can start to say, you start to get into mezzanine financing, for instance. You see that a lot in the C corps. So you can say, okay, well, this class of stock, might get this percentage of return, and this class of stock is only investor class; they're not voting class. Those are all things you typically see with the C corps, But you can also, in a backdoor sort of way, make those divisions in an LLC as well.
Right. And you see these things very commonly in a lot of the tech stocks now, Google, Facebook, companies like that, where the founders of the companies have the bulk of the voting stock, but they don't actually own the bulk of the company. Investors own the bulk of the company. So,
Correct.
They have control over the company, but not the ownership.
Correct. And that is a concern that I see at all levels. So again, with the S corps, with the LLCs, with the partnerships, that's where you start to get into even the limited partnerships. So with the limited partnerships, you will frequently see the managing partners and the limited partners. Or with the LLCs, you'll see the managing members and the non-managing members. So, there are the people who want to invest, they want to be somewhat involved in the operations, but they really don't they want to be the silent partners. Um, but they also, in a traditional limited partnership, they have to be very careful, because if they, again, honest, I'm not talking about, these huge corporations. I'm talking sort of, 10 and under, or 25 and under limited partnerships, or 25 and under limited liability companies. Sometimes you get limited partners, or you get non-managing members who are asked to step up to the plate, or they decide they don't like the way things are managed and they start to take a more active role, and they suddenly find themselves accidentally being, managing partners, or de facto, general partners. And again, one of the things that I see very frequently is people can have a great plan on paper, but you then have to put it into practice.
Yes.
And if the paper and the practice don't match, then you're going to end up bumping your nose either with the IRS or in a legal capacity, because you're not following the rules, So.
Along those lines, if you find out that you've set something up the wrong way, is it easy to switch the type of company that you have, or are you stuck?
No, it is possible, but again, it depends on the type of structure. So, with the sole proprietorships and with the general partnerships, again, you have to look at the assets, the debts, the liabilities. Those are all personal to the investors. So that's one of the things that the IRS looked at, is the continuity of life. If that partner, or if that sole proprietor passes away, or declares bankruptcy, the entity itself is pretty much, heading towards dissolution, or, being defunct. With a corporation, um, it it continues its life. So in terms of the assets, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, well, I mean, in essence, if you figure out that you're in business and you have the wrong structure for your company,
Right.
how easy is it to switch?
Right. So
Oh,
then
sure.
going to the corporations, um, again, the interest is transferable, but the assets belong to the corporation. And so frequently we'll see you can either buy the capital interest or you can buy the assets of the corporation. So depending on what you have with a corporation, the more formal the structure, if you are required to register your entity with the Secretary of State, which is what would happen with limited partnerships, corporations, then it also follows that the dissolution process or the change process would also be more difficult. Um, but that's not to say, I mean, you can always close down one corporation, start up another. I saw that very frequently as a way of avoiding creditors, um, which is another story unto itself. But I mean, the thing is, you can, as an investor, it's very easy to transfer or to change, um, ownership. But again, it depends on whether the assets and the debts are part of a separate structure or part of, the personal assets of the investors.
Right. So when you change structures, you are essentially creating a new company that may or may not buy all of the assets and liabilities of the previous company.
Correct, exactly. And there is, with the corporations, there's a whole statutory structure of what has to happen um, in the dissolution process. So for instance, all the debts have to be paid, then the capital funds have to be replenished. Then, I mean, so there's a whole structure that goes on because the sole proprietorship and the general partnerships are so easy to start up. They're easy to take down. I mean, it's okay, this business didn't work, so I'm just putting everything back into my personal account and I'm starting up this new business. I mean,
Right.
you know, but once you start to get into capitalization with corporations, then you have to say, huh, this is a capital asset. This belongs to the corporation, and so the process of taking it back down is also more difficult.
All right. So obviously the more complex the structure, the more difficult it is to change afterwards.
Correct.
I also do want to mention we're just about at the end of our time, but before we go, I do want to mention to our listeners that different states handle each of these differently. So be sure to contact someone in your state for the specific regulations regarding each type of company. I know states like Wyoming, Delaware, Nevada are very business friendly. Their regulations are a lot easier. When you deal with someone like California, they're very strict. So make sure you speak to somebody who's familiar with the business structures for your state.
Correct. And also, let me mention that I am an attorney admitted in Rhode Island and Connecticut, but I am not purporting to give legal advice to anybody in particular, and that you should absolutely consult both an attorney and an accountant for your particular business situation, because we're speaking in generalities today, but your particular situation might be different, and I'm not necessarily purporting to give legal
Right.
advice to any particular individual today. So,
All right. Well, Rita, thank you so much for coming on. Chip, do you have any final questions for her?
No, thanks a lot for the education. Obviously, as you said, the most important thing you can do is contact an attorney and an accountant so you can figure out the best way to set this thing up. Because if you don't set it up right in the first place, it's going to be a lot of trouble moving ahead. So plan
exactly.
ahead and do it the right way.
And the other thing I'd like to mention too is that make sure your attorney and your accountant are on the same page. and that you understand what the rules are, because again, I've seen that very frequently be a source of either legal problems or tax problems for individuals. They think they're setting up things one way, and what they do in the course of the business doesn't dovetail well with that. So that's the other piece I'd like to say.
Absolutely. As we said when we did our episode on business plans, corporate structures are very complicated. It's a very detailed topic. We've just scratched the surface here. So before you make any decisions, remember to do your research. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch us every week at xvadio.com/podcasts. You can also find us on the iTunes Store, Apple Podcasts app, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. See you then.